Very disturbing winter horror stories. The snow had already begun to fall heavily as Angela turned off the highway. The tires crunched over the thickening blanket of snow on the back roads. She didn't know why she had come. Maybe it was the need for silence, or maybe she was just hoping that some time alone would help her forget. The house loomed ahead, a cold, ancient thing standing at the edge of town. Surrounded by thick, almost suffocating woods, it had always been there, silent, waiting. But now, with her mother gone, Angela was left to face it alone. The house, the memories, everything. The car bumped over the uneven snow-packed driveway as Angela slowly came to a stop. Her hands, still gripping the wheel, felt icy, not just from the cold, no. There was something else, a deeper, gnawing sense of unease. The storm outside raged, but the house stood still, unmoved, impassive. The wind howled, whipping snow against the windows. Angela grabbed her suitcase, hesitating for a moment before opening the door. Her breath fogged up instantly, the chill hitting her like a slap across the face. The house in front of her seemed so alive. It felt like it was watching, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Angela forced herself to step out of the car. She could hear the deep, muffled crunch of snow beneath her boots as she made her way to the front door. Each step felt like it carried the weight of years of memories. She reached for the old brass doorknob, its coldness sinking into her skin as she turned it. The door creaked open, releasing a low groan as though the house itself was waking up. Angela hesitated. The house, it felt wrong. It always had, but now, after everything, it felt worse. The cold air inside struck her with more force than she anticipated. The smell of old wood and dust filled her nose, the familiar scent that reminded her of times long past, times she had tried to forget. She placed her suitcase by the door and stood there for a moment, taking in the space. It was still the same. The old wallpaper, the faded furniture, the broken clock on the wall that never seemed to work. Everything looked like it was frozen in time. A chill ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from something else. She couldn't put her finger on it. Angela looked toward the stairs. She didn't want to go up, not yet. Her mother's bedroom was at the top of the stairs, the room where everything had changed. But she had to. She had to face it. She had to face the memories. With a shaky breath, she climbed the stairs. The old wood groaned under her feet. It was as if the house was trying to stop her, like it was alive, aware. Her pulse quickened as she reached the top. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her mind, calling her name. Number, she couldn't think like that. The bedroom door creaked open, the sound painfully loud in the silence of the house. She stepped inside. The room felt heavy, suffocating. The same faded wallpaper, the same quilt on the bed, but now it felt empty in a way that made her chest tighten. She walked slowly toward the window, her heart pounding in her ears. The sound of her own breathing so loud it almost drowned out everything else. The snow outside was falling thick, like a soft blanket that muffled the world. But there, beyond the snow, beyond the trees, something felt off. She couldn't explain it. The wind outside howled like a distant cry, like it was begging to be heard. Angela's gaze snapped to the reflection in the window. For a split second, just a split second, she saw a shadow, a figure standing motionless behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. Number it couldn't be. She turned around, her breath hitching in her throat, the air suddenly colder around her. The room was empty. No one was there. Her pulse was racing, her skin prickling, as if something unseen was brushing against her. "Get a grip, Angela," she whispered to herself, forcing her breath to steady. It had to be the stress, the house, the storm. It was all playing tricks on her. But then, there it was again. A faint sound. Footsteps. Downstairs. Her blood ran cold. Her body froze, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move for what felt like an eternity, standing at the center of the room, straining to hear. Was it the wind? Or someone was downstairs? Angela swallowed hard. It was probably just the house settling, right? But no. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. She didn't think. She couldn't. She rushed toward the door, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorknob, her heart hammering against her chest. The door creaked open. The hallway outside was empty, but the air felt thick, suffocating. It pressed against her as if it was trying to hold her in place, making her unable to move. It felt like the walls themselves were watching her. Angela's legs felt like lead as she descended the stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn back, to leave, to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. Downstairs everything looked the same. Everything was still. No one was there, but the silence was deafening. The light from the old chandelier flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her stomach twisted in a way that made her want to throw up. Angela stumbled forward, her eyes darting around the room. She stepped toward the mirror on the wall. She needed something to ground herself. Her reflection stared back at her, her pale face, wide eyes. But then, it wasn't her. For a split second, there was a figure in the reflection, behind her, standing in the darkened corner of the room. Her blood ran cold. Angela spun around, panic surging through her, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing. Her breath came in ragged gasps now, and the cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones. The house seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing closer. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of something oppressive and unseen. The mirror. She had to get away from it. She turned to the door, hands shaking, and rushed to the front entrance. The wind howled and snow poured into the house, but Angela didn't care. She didn't stop. Her feet hit the snow, her heart racing in her chest as she stumbled through the storm. But even as she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, that it was still there, waiting for her to come back. The house. The house had never let her go. This is very terrifying winter horror story number 2. The wind screamed. It wasn't the usual winter gust. It was shrill, piercing, as though something unseen was crying out in agony. Snow Ridge, the tiny village buried in the forgotten valley, was no stranger to harsh winters. But this winter was different. Something was out there. Isabella Hart sat by her crackling hearth, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the walls of her modest cottage. She wrapped her hands around a chipped mug, trying to draw warmth not just to her fingers, but to the chill seeping into her chest. Her grandson Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed as he worked on a puzzle. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of the firewood. "Gran?" Ethan's voice broke the quiet, hesitant. She glanced at him. "Yes, love? Do you think it's real?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "The thing in the snow?" Isabella froze for a moment. Her eyes flickered to the frosted window pane. The wind howled, rattling the shutters as if on cue. She forced a soft laugh. "What thing, Ethan?" "You know," he shifted uncomfortably. "The shadow. Mrs. Caldwell said she saw it last year. She said it was watching her." The word sent an unbidden shiver crawling down Isabella's spine. Her fingers tightened on the mug. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "People see strange things in the snow," she said, keeping her tone light. "The wind plays tricks on your ears, and the shadows, well, the shadows shift with the moonlight. That's all." "But what if it's not just shadows?" Ethan pressed. His eyes were wide, searching hers for reassurance. She held his gaze. "Then we'll face it together," she said firmly. But even as she said it, doubt twisted in her gut. The next morning, Isabella bundled Ethan in layer after layer of scarves and wool. His small face peeked out from under the hood of his coat. She knelt, adjusting his gloves, and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her voice low and serious. "You can go out to play, but do not go beyond the old mill. The snow is deep. If you get lost—" "I won't, Gran," Ethan interrupted, smiling up at her. "I promise." But promises, especially from adventurous 12-year-olds, were fragile things. The world outside was a muted expanse of white. The snow seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the faint crunch of Ethan's boots as he wandered toward the mill. His breath billowed in the freezing air, and his cheeks turned rosy under the biting wind. He reached the mill, a rotting, forgotten structure with a sagging roof. For a moment, he hesitated. The clearing beyond the mill was forbidden, but curiosity tugged at him. Ethan glanced back toward the village. The rooftops were barely visible through the trees. "It's just a little further," he muttered to himself. The snow deepened as he ventured into the forest. The silence was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. And then he saw them. Footprints. They were massive, larger than any humans. The prints trailed in an erratic pattern, the steps uneven, almost dragging. His stomach twisted, but his curiosity burned hotter. He followed the trail until he came to a clearing where a lone tree stood, blackened and gnarled, its bark charred as if by fire. The footprints ended abruptly at the tree. No animal, no person, just nothing. Ethan stared at the tree, his breath hitching. The silence grew louder, pressing against his eardrums. Then, there it was, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of his vision. He spun around, his heart hammering, nothing. And then he heard it, the whispering. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, like the rustling of leaves in a non-existent breeze. But it grew louder and louder. The words were foreign, twisted, wrong. They weren't meant for human ears. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers didn't stop. Fear flooded his veins, and he ran, blindly, recklessly, snow tearing at his legs. He didn't stop until he was back at the mill, gasping for breath, tears freezing on his cheeks. When he burst through the door of the cottage, Isabella jumped to her feet. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "Just got scared, that's all." But Isabella wasn't fooled. That night, long after Ethan had fallen into a restless sleep, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. The wind howled outside, carrying with it a sound that made her blood run cold, whispers. The next day, Isabella marched to Mrs. Caldwell's house. The older woman answered the door with a wary look, clutching a shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Isabella," she said, her voice thin, "what brings you here?" "I need to know what you saw last winter," Isabella said bluntly. "The shadow." Mrs. Caldwell's face drained of color. She stepped aside, shutting the door quickly behind her. "I don't like to speak of it," she murmured. "But I saw it, late one night, during the worst storm. It stood in the snow, just standing. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was wrong." "Wrong how?" Isabella pressed. "It moved like smoke," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "And it saw me," her voice cracked. "Even though it didn't have eyes, I could feel it looking at me. It disappeared before I could scream." Isabella's hands trembled. She left Mrs. Caldwell's house with more questions than answers. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the dark, snow-blanketed forest. And then he saw it. A shadow, tall, shapeless, moving, no, gliding across the snow. It stopped and turned. It was watching him. "Gran!" Ethan screamed, stumbling backward. Isabella ran into the room. What is it?" Ethan pointed at the window, his hand trembling. "It's out there!" She peered outside but saw only darkness. Still, her gut twisted with an instinctive dread. She locked the door, pulled the curtain shut, and kept Ethan close. The whispers began again that night, soft at first, then louder, inside the house. Isabella gripped the fire poker as the sound moved to the door. The handle rattled violently, as though something or someone was trying to break in. "Leave us alone," Isabella shouted, her voice cracking. The door fell silent, but she could feel it, still there, waiting. At dawn, the villagers gathered, their faces pale and drawn. One by one, they shared their stories of the shadow and the whispers. Isabella stood, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "We can't hide from this thing anymore. We have to face it, together." And so, that night, armed with lanterns and trembling courage, they returned to the old mill. The whispers began almost immediately. The shadow emerged, growing, stretching, towering over them. It wasn't just darkness, it was hunger. Isabella stepped forward, her lantern shaking in her hand. "You don't belong here," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the whispers. This is our home. The shadow paused, its form rippling. Then slowly it began to shrink, its edges dissolving like mist at sunrise. The whispers faded, replaced by silence, so deep it felt holy. When the villagers returned to their homes that night, Snow Ridge was no longer haunted, but the memory of the shadow lingered, and in the stillness of winter nights, when the wind howled just right, they swore they could still hear the faintest whisper of the snow. This is the most creepy winter horror story number 3. Winters in Frosthaven were merciless. Snow buried the town like a shroud, muffling the world in silence. Most nights, that silence was peaceful. But this winter, the silence was broken. It started as a faint sound, a whisper carried on the icy wind. At first, people thought it was just the wind howling through the trees, but soon, it became unmistakable. It was a wail, low, sorrowful, and achingly human. Marianne Calloway sat alone at her kitchen table. The storm outside rattled the windows, snow piling against the panes. She sipped her tea, its warmth doing little to calm the unease crawling up her spine. The sound had started days ago, soft, almost imperceptible. But tonight it was louder, much louder. A low, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Mom!" Marianne flinched, nearly spilling her tea. She turned to see Lily, her 9-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit, her small face pale. "Did you hear that?" Lily's voice trembled. Marianne forced a smile, though her hand shook as she set the mug down. "It's just the wind, sweetheart. You know how storms can sound." Lily shook her head. "No, it's not the wind. It sounds like someone crying." Marianne felt a chill deeper than the cold outside. She knelt beside Lily, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "There's nothing to be afraid of," she said, though her voice faltered. "Why don't you go back to bed? I'll check it out." Lily hesitated, her wide eyes searching Marianne's face. "Promise? I promise?" As Lily padded back to her room, Marianne stayed by the window, her breath fogging the glass. The sound came again, closer this time, rising and falling like a terrible, mournful song. Her chest tightened as she whispered to herself, "What is that?" The next morning, Marianne bundled herself in her thickest coat and made her way into town. Frosthaven was a small, weather-beaten place, its few shops and houses huddled against the endless snow. Inside the general store, a group of locals gathered around the wood stove, their faces drawn with worry. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that begged not to be broken. "Marianne," Henry Porter greeted her, his voice gruff. "You've heard it, haven't you?" Marianne nodded, glancing around at the others. What is it, Henry? It doesn't sound natural." Henry sighed, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "It started after that hiker went missing," he said, his voice low. "Hiker. Came through town last week," Henry explained. "Young guy. Said he was heading to the lake to camp. Big storm came through that night. No one's seen him since." The mention of the lake made Marianne's stomach twist. The lake was a place of whispers and old fears, a frozen expanse no one visited willingly. "You think it's him? Out there?" Henry hesitated, his gaze dropping to his coffee. "I don't know what to think anymore." That night, the wailing became unbearable. Marianne sat by the fire, every muscle in her body tense. The sound wasn't just outside anymore. It felt like it was inside, creeping through the walls, pressing against her chest. "Mom?" She turned sharply, her heart pounding. Lily stood in the doorway again, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears. "It's calling me," Lily whispered. Marianne's breath caught. "What did you say?" Lily's voice trembled. "It said my name." Marianne rushed to her daughter, pulling her into her arms. "It's just a bad dream," she said, though her voice cracked. "You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." But as she held Lily close, the sound rose again, louder than before. And this time, it sounded like a name. Her name. The next morning, Marianne made a decision. "I'm going to the lake," she told Sarah, her neighbor, as she dropped Lily off. Sarah's face went pale. "The lake? Are you out of your mind?" "I have to know what's out there," Marianne said, her voice shaking. "I can't just sit here." Sarah gripped her arm, her voice urgent. "Be careful, please." The forest was eerily quiet as Marianne made her way toward the lake. The only sound was the crunch of her boots in the snow, the trees standing like frozen sentinels around her. The wailing grew louder with every step, cutting through the stillness like a blade. When she reached the lake, her breath hitched. The ice stretched out before her, black and jagged, its surface reflecting the pale gray sky. And there, in the center, a figure. Marianne froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. It stood motionless, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Marianne took a hesitant step onto the ice, her boots slipping slightly. The cold seeped through her coat, biting into her skin. As she moved closer, the figure became clearer. It wasn't human. It was tall, dark, and shapeless, like a shadow pulled from the depths of a nightmare. The wailing stopped. The silence was suffocating. The figure turned toward her. It had no face, no features, but Marianne felt its gaze, a piercing, unbearable weight. Her breath caught, her body frozen in place, and then it pointed. Marianne followed its gesture, her heart sinking. At the edge of the ice, half buried in snow, was the body of the missing hiker. His face was frozen in a twisted mask of terror. Marianne staggered backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadow began to move toward her. She ran. She didn't stop until she burst through Sarah's door, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. "Marianne!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing to her side. "What happened?" But Marianne couldn't speak. She could only shake her head. The image of the shadow and the hiker burned into her mind. The townsfolk gathered that night at the edge of the forest. They lit a massive bonfire, their prayers rising into the cold, dark sky. The wailing stopped, but the memory of that winter lingered in Frosthaven like a shadow that would never leave. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the trees, some claimed they could still hear it, a faint, mournful cry, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed.